Once our bolus of food has been chewed up and mixed together with saliva from the mouth, it will then move into the pharynx, which is the throat. And the pharynx consists of three parts: the nasopharynx, which is behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is behind the larynx. So once you have chewed up your food and you're going to swallow it, that bolus will move into the oropharynx and into the laryngopharynx, and hopefully not back up into the nasopharynx. And that is one of the jobs of the uvula, is to help direct the food into the proper passageway so it doesn't end up in the nasopharynx. You've probably all experienced if you hiccup and swallow some soda the wrong way, sometimes it'll go into the nasopharynx and out your nose. So sometimes things do get by the uvula, but the point of the uvula basically is to keep things going in the right direction. We also have this epiglottis here, which is very important, and that will close over the trachea. So when you actually swallow and you initiate swallowing consciously, when you swallow, you're actually going to stop breathing for a moment, and this epiglottis will close over the trachea so that the food and liquid, whatever it is that you're swallowing, will go into the correct passageway and will not go into the trachea, where it would then end up in the lungs and can cause all kinds of problems. This is called aspiration when that happens, and it can predispose people to things like pneumonia. So the epiglottis is a very important part of the larynx that's going to close over the trachea when you swallow to prevent food and liquids from getting into the trachea, so that they stay in the esophagus as you swallow. All right, so the next place, obviously, is the esophagus. So once the food moves out of the throat, it's going to move into the esophagus, which is about 25 centimeters long or 10 inches. And this is going to convey the food to the stomach. And it's going to begin actually a little bit lower than this diagram shows, but behind what's called the cricoid cartilage, which is a little cartilage right at the top of the trachea. It's going to begin posterior to that and is going to enter into the abdominal pelvic cavity through what we call the esophageal hiatus. So we have actually within the diaphragm, we have a passageway, a little hole or a hiatus, if you will, for the esophagus. And this esophageal hiatus is basically going to allow the esophagus to enter from the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity. So the esophagus has, when it's not doing anything, it's folded on itself. So the lumen is all folded up in on itself, and you're not going to see it an open lumen until a bolus actually passes through there. And we're going to have some muscles in the esophagus that is very similar to what we've seen with other digestive organs, except that the composition of muscle will actually change as we move through the esophagus. So you have to remember that swallowing, the first part of swallowing, is a conscious effort. You have to think about swallowing the food you're going to eat. So the first third of the esophagus is actually dominated by skeletal muscle. The middle third of the esophagus is going to have a transition between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. And then we're going to have the bottom third of the esophagus, the inferior third that leads to the stomach, will be entirely smooth muscle, because at this point, once you have initiated the swallowing movement, the bolus will then be conveyed down through the esophagus completely by reflex or by subconscious processes. The esophagus, just like other areas, has three layers. We have our mucosa, we have our submucosa, and our muscularis. And as I said, this muscularis, unlike other areas in the digestive tract, will contain a bit of skeletal muscle near the superior portion, and that will gradually change into smooth muscle as we go inferiorly. So as we recall, the epithelium within the esophagus is non-keratinized, and it is a stratified squamous epithelium because we are still experiencing lots of abrasion as things are moving from the mouth and the throat to the stomach. So we also, as we've talked about before, if we look at the lumen of the esophagus, it's not entirely round when the esophagus is not actually conveying a bolus. It's actually kind of infolded in on itself. You can see a picture of that in your textbook, and we'll sort of be able to see that from one of the slides we will get to in just a minute. But these folds are going to run the length of the esophagus, and they'll kind of open up as a bolus moves through it. All right, so we have a lot of glands in here. So we've got esophageal glands, which will be producing mucus. Here again, this is going to be important for reducing the friction between the bolus and the esophageal lining. The fact that the esophageal lining is stratified squamous epithelium allows it to be robust to abrasion, but by the same token, we want to resist or reduce friction as much as possible. And as before, the muscularis externa, especially when we get down to that posterior or inferior third, is going to have a circular layer of smooth muscle in the inside or closest to the lumen, and then a longitudinal layer outside of that. All right, here's a picture of it. Here we can see our stratified squamous epithelium. It's quite thick. And then under that, we have our lamina propria, which is our areolar connective tissue. And here's our muscularis mucosa right here. You can see that we're looking at these transversely, so this is the circular layer. So this would be coming out of the page towards you. Swallowing itself is called deglutition, and we have several phases of it. We've got the buccal phase, and this is when the bolus is in your mouth, and we're pushing it back towards the throat here, and we can see that the soft palate here is going to help. You see the uvula, how it goes back there and tries to prevent that bolus from getting up in the nasopharynx. We're going to have the buccal phase is going to be initiated consciously. And then once you get it swallowed, or you get that, start that process of swallowing or deglutition, the bolus is going to move into the pharyngeal phase, which means it's now in the throat. Notice that the epiglottis has closed, and it is closed over this passageway called the trachea, and that will prevent material from moving into the lungs. So as the bolus passes past the pharynx or the throat, then we are in the esophageal phase, and this is when the bolus is entirely in the esophagus. Peristalsis will occur where this act of swallowing is entirely under the control of the autonomic nervous system. At this point, it's a reflex movement. We're not thinking about it. It's just moving on its own. And finally, we have the bolus entering into the stomach, and this is where we will begin more mechanical processing on the bolus as well as more digestion. We're going to start the digestion of proteins in the stomach. So once we get to the stomach, we can first talk about what the stomach does. It's going to start mechanically breaking down ingested food, and it does this because it has a bit of motility. And the stomach has an extra layer of smooth muscle. So not only do we have our circular layer and our longitudinal layer, but interior to that, we're actually going to have an oblique layer. And that's going to help the stomach mix back and forth, and that's going to help the mechanical breakdown of food. It's going to take a while for food to move out of the stomach, and it's going to take a while for these processes to happen. So we're going to have storage of ingested food until we can get not only good mechanical breakdown, but also we're going to start actual chemical digestive processes in here. So we're going to see that we have the excretion of hydrochloric acid by the stomach into the lumen, and this will not only kill pathogens, it will deactivate enzymes that we may have ingested that were part of whatever it is we ate, whatever the organism was that we ate. We're deactivating any enzymes that they may have, and we're also breaking the protein down from their complex quaternary and tertiary structures into long chains that make it much easier for peptidases or proteases, enzymes that digest protein, to have access to those amino acid chains and be able to break the bonds between the amino acids. We also have the production of something called intrinsic factor. And this is a very important glycoprotein that will help us absorb vitamin B. And the absorption of vitamin B will take place in the small intestine, but we have to have this intrinsic factor be able to bind with it before it can be absorbed. And if we don't get enough vitamin B, if we're unable to absorb vitamin B, then we can have a condition called pernicious anemia, and we won't be able to form red blood cells. All right, let's look at the anatomy of the stomach. So we've seen in the previous slide that it's kind of a J-shaped thing. It has a lesser curvature on the medial surface, greater curvature on the lateral surface, and we've got a lot of ability for this thing to distend, that is expand, and contract. And we will have special folds within the lumen of the stomach that are called rugae. And these things will allow the stomach to expand out and contract. And so these folds will become less obvious as the stomach expands. And then when the stomach is in a relaxed state, there's nothing much in it, then these folds will be quite prominent. All right, so here's a picture of it. Here we have the stomach. We have the main portion called the body. Where the esophagus comes in right here, this area is called the cardia, because if we were, here's part of the liver cut away, if we were to go just above the diaphragm here, we would see that this cardia portion of the stomach is close to the heart. Makes sense. We have the fundus, which is going to be the curved part up here. This is called the fundus, and we often see the term fundus used for a curved dome-like structure. Then we're going to have the body, which is the main portion of the stomach. That's going to be this right here. Then we're going to have the pyloric antrum that's going to lead into the pylorus. And the pylorus is the last part of the stomach before we get to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. So the stomach itself is going to have these structures and within it, or I guess that define the physical part of the stomach, as well as the curvature. This lesser curvature here we can see part of the lesser omentum that is communicating really between the liver and the stomach here. And then we see part of the greater omentum, which we saw in the last series. And the greater omentum is this giant sheet, mesentery type sheet that hangs down over the small intestine and actually follows the curvatures of it quite nicely and interdigitates between some of the folds of the small intestine and has all of these fatty bits in it. And so some people have dubbed this the fatty apron. And as I say, in my lab in previous years, I've had students call it the cheese skirt because it kind of looks like that. Now let's look at some of the interior features of the stomach. One of the first things you'll notice is there's an extra layer of smooth muscle in the muscularis externa. And this is an oblique layer, and this is going to be closest to the lumen, and it's going to allow for extra motility in the churning and mixing of contents that come into the stomach. Well, the other things you will see are the presence of rugae. And these are infoldings of the epithelium, of the mucosa within the surface. And this is going to allow for the stomach to distend and expand quite a bit. And as the stomach expands, these rugae will flatten out. But as the stomach then empties, then the rugae will become quite prominent once again. So when we look at the mucosa of the stomach, we have to remember that now we've transitioned to a simple columnar epithelium. And this is a secretory sheet. What does that mean? That means it's producing lots of things. One of the main things is mucus. And mucus is going to cover the entire interior surface of the stomach. This is why we see very little absorption in the stomach. We won't start absorption until we get into the small intestine. And the reason for that is we have to protect the stomach from all of these caustic things, these enzymes and these acids that are in it. So we can't really start absorbing things across that thick mucus coat very easily. There are a few things that can be absorbed through the stomach, alcohol being one of them. And alcohol can actually damage the thick mucus coat. And there are some substances, if we have too much stomach acid, for example, that can damage that mucus coat and cause things like ulcers. What produces these secretions? We have gastric pits, and this is going to have glands in them and cells that are going to be secreting stuff, and these are going to open out onto the gastric surface. And we're going to see a lot of mucus cells that are sitting at the neck of these things, and we're going to see a lot of basal cells, or I should say cells, stem cells that are going to be producing new cells and replacing the cells in the covering or the mucosa of the stomach, because this is a very active area and these cells are replaced often because of the kinds of stresses that they see, both in terms of physical stresses and chemical stresses.